Hello, and welcome to this podcast on gamification of workplace learning, where we talk to leaders and experts in the field to get their insights and learn from their experiences. Today, we have with us Rob Alvarez, who's an international keynote speaker and an advocate and expert on use of games and gamification in education and learning. Some of you may know him from his podcast known as Professor Game. He's also an associate director of executive education at IE University in Madrid, where he gets to work with firms, both from private and public sectors, to create learning strategies and content like management simulations, interactive case studies, and gamified learning experiences. I've been following Rob for some time, and I find him to be very experienced in this domain. So with this brief intro, let's invite Rob to this podcast. Rob, very welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Amit. Happy to be here.
I am so happy to have you here, Rob. Rob, you've had some fantastic experiences in life, right from your education days. Uh, I'd love to hear about your journey and what have you been doing in your past roles, and also what are your focus areas today?
Sure. So the whole journey in gamification, of course, starts with games, and I started happily very early. It came with my first Nintendo, right? Those were the times, and I dreamt of working for the Nintendo magazine or the Nintendo Power. I don't remember really the name. Then I grew up, and that was a very lofty goal. I eventually studied engineering, computer engineering. I realized during computer engineering that programming was fun and nice, but that I would not be doing it for the rest of my life. Like I was approaching graduation fast, and I realized I had fun with technology and things related, but I didn't want to be sitting down programming for the rest of my life, and I didn't. First thing I did was work at Procter & Gamble it was very technology related, but it was in that sense from what I was thinking at that point, it was sort of the dream job, right? I was working with technology, I understood the people, but I was in the middle. I was not the guy working in the market, and I was not the one doing the programming. So I was exactly that link that was necessary there, and it helped me grow a lot. I also did a long stint at the public sector. I worked with some fellow friends who were back home from what is right now the opposition. Basically, I was in a regional government working with the youth sector. I spent many years there, also with local working together with local governments and so on. It was fun. I was very inspired to do that, but eventually, the situation in my country led us to leave, and we were at that point also building a consultancy on social media. So you see how things start mixing in with technology, making an impact as well with the public sector. And we moved to Spain. And in Spain, I've been working ever since at IE University. One of the things I realized during my career is that education, and even before, to be honest, even during the university, I had some small stints as a teaching assistant. It's something that I always enjoyed, being in the classroom, being in that situation of helping others reach their goals in that sort of fashion, something that always called my attention. And I found the opportunity here in Spain, and I jumped over it. It was a project manager, then senior project manager. We are creating online interactive learning materials, and we also brought in the paper written ones. That's the point where I realized my lifelong dream of working for the Nintendo magazine could have an adult version of that, because we are creating these materials that are very interactive. And I realized, as nobody probably had really thought about it in the department, that they were doing gamification without knowing or without being very intentional about it. So what I did was precisely that, sort of try to bring it together, find some theory, understand this a little bit deeper, and started talking about it in conferences and so on. And I said, well, our materials are sold to other universities and corporations. But then that's when I realized I wanted to make a bigger of an impact with game-based learning, game-based solutions, gamification. And I did have, again, as you can see, there's many things that are sort of tied together that happened. I spent almost a year broadcasting through a radio network. It was a program, a radio program. I didn't have the license. So to be in a radio, officially in radio and have, especially for advertising, you need to have a license. So I partnered up with a friend who did have the license.
Mm-hmm.
After the program finished, so to speak, we sort of dropped it. We were just paying for the expenses. To be honest, the signal was not the best one. The radio was great, but it was not necessarily the best place for that type of program. We dropped it and I went into the course. I learned, I got my license. And after I got the license, I moved to Spain. So it's worthless at this point. So with that experience, I started looking into podcasting. I pretty much, to be fair, I went in late into the game. I didn't, podcasting has been around for quite a long while. I started actually, really following podcasts maybe in 2014, 15. And, the podcast started by now. We started in 2017. So almost 4 years ago at this point. But, it took a few years of understanding the medium and saying, well, I want to bring this impact of gamification. I have my whole background on learning and gamification. Why not do a podcast? And there you can really, instead of going for a local radio, why not, impact, ideally millions of people worldwide. Of course, that's still not the case. We are aiming eventually towards that. But as you know, gamification is at this point a niche in many ways. And we're happy with our audience. The engagers are fantastic. So that's kind of what it looks like. At this point nowadays, that has led me also to do workshops all around the world around gamification. Talks with the podcast. I do some consultancy to a limited level because I'm still working full time. I'm also teaching part time at the university where I work at and other universities as well, doing workshops with professional development agencies. So there's many things going on and sort of flourishing from that. And I'm very happy that the place this is at and where it seems to be heading as well. Very excited about the future.
Fantastic. I mean, that's such a fascinating journey. And you're right, you don't know what all will click together and what all you do in early life that will come as useful when you start picking up your career of choice or passion.
Yeah.
So I could see early on, I think you had, because of the games you played, you had a collaborative mindset, which helped well, I would imagine. But one thing that resonated very well with me was that people at your university were also doing things which were not called gamification, but similar to gamification. And this is something that, I was recently listening to Carl Kapp on one of his videos. And, he made a very interesting point saying that all the principles that drive gamification are essentially the same principles that you use for making learning engaging. They're very, very similar if you were to use them. So maybe you are using it, but you're not calling it gamification. Probably it's sometimes okay that way, because the moment you get into gamification, you start calling them points, badges, and leaderboards to begin with. Anyway, we'll get a little more into that, but thank you for sharing that, Rob.
Sure.
I wanted to get your thoughts on, and since you speak to so many experts on your own podcast, which, by the way, I have to tell you, is quite popular, even if, it may not be millions, but it is quite popular, one of the well-known series in this domain. So since you talk to so many of them on gamification and how people are leveraging it, what is the general understanding that you get of gamification out there? Have we really moved beyond PBLs to some extent? You mentioned, I think briefly, that it was a hot word a little while ago. It may not be as hot or hyped, if I can call it, the word itself.
Yeah, so many things to unpack there. First of all, PBL, points, badges, and leaderboards. That's the go-to, when people say, oh, gamification, the first thing they think about is points, badges, and leaderboards. And it's normal. Those are easy elements to implement. And I'm not saying they're bad. They can work for many things, but you have to think about it. And that's the difficult part. It's not a one size fits all, like, oh, gamification, points, badges, and leaderboards, you design about how you want to do the competition to go. And that's definitely not it. Sometimes it is a way to go. I'm not saying it doesn't work. I'm not saying that's not the way to go always. But the thing is, I always argue that the gamification is a design discipline. So you're creating things for a group of people. So there's people involved. This is not just the function that you want to achieve. And Yukai talks about function-focused design versus human-focused design, right? And that is the kind of thing that I'm talking about here. You have to think there's humans behind this, and you have to think about this from that perspective. It's not the same humans, doing this kind of thing. It's not the same profile, the same motivations than other, activities. And it's not just age ranges, it's motivations in general. It's something that we have to consider. So that is the first point. Then about the hype, I'm pretty happy to sort of report that, the hype is almost gone. I mean, if you go to LinkedIn, right, how many people do you find that have on their, in their headline gamification? Very, well, few, relatively few. It's not like now you type, I don't know, AI, and you probably get like 50% of people are saying that they do something around AI, whether that's true or not, right? Because that's the hype. If you're not into AI, you're into nothing. I'm not into AI, so I'm probably in nothing. I'm mostly dedicated to gamification. AI is a lot more complex than some people acknowledge, as many other trends. So I'm happy to report that in general, that tends to be the case. And the people who are still in the space, since it's not part of the hype anymore, tend to be doing mostly real work. And I quote unquote here. So they're really getting into gamification, trying to go into the deep end and really understand what's behind it, and how, to use those strategies and to gather and to make those designs really thought through for that. However, of course, you will still find providers probably who were built, during the hype, who say, we have gamification, just here it is. And you have this learning platform, and the platform has points, badges, and leaderboards, and they say that it's gamified, and it has a progress bar as well. Like, well, yes, that could work in some audiences, in some cases, but that's not all. That's not it. Sometimes, and if you just use that, you very well might just fail.
Yeah,
pretty often, right? And that's where the Gartner says, I don't know, remember the number right now, but like 85% of gamification projects will fail. Of course, if you don't think about what you're doing, it's, I don't know, let's say financial consulting. If you try to grab this exact same recipe for every company you consult, well, chances are most of them are not going to have the same problems, and they're going to fail. So the project is going to fail. It's not the strategy. The strategy is not bad. You have to think about and adapt for every different scenario. And that's where gamification is, a lot bigger than just points, badges, and leaderboards.
True. Absolutely. And of course, when you adapt, you have to look at the context in which each of these organizations operates. It could be very different. As you mentioned, it is ultimately about humans who are going to consume it and work with it. So, yeah. And you have to do that study, just can't really transport one solution to every organization. But just picking up on the point on hype cycle, I think it's a good thing that it has gone through that high point and is at the low point, because that's where you find the real practitioners, people who are absolutely passionate about it, discovering the real mechanics, if we can call it, if it's not a wrong word to use here, but the actual things that will work. And that helps, the market to really start seeing the value of this or anything, whether it is gamification or AI. I'm sure AI will go through its own cycle. But yeah. So sure. Are you also saying that PBLs, while they are not bad in themselves, they are a good starting point sometimes, maybe, but at the same time, they can also work in certain situations if you do it decently well. Just don't depend on them always.
I just wouldn't like to call them a starting point, because again, the starting point is thinking about, I even have an episode where I think like these general 5 steps that you take when you're designing something. And the first, the starting point actually is thinking what you want to achieve. Like, why are you even bringing gamification to the plate? Yeah. And match that with what gamification can actually do, right? Sometimes what you're looking for is, I always use the very obvious example, like, oh, your platform is broken. You don't fix the broken platform by introducing gamification. You'll actually probably make it more complex, and it'll be further broken down, right? You fix the platform, and if it's not working, and the problem you have is the motivation of people or retention or behavioral change, then maybe you want to look at gamification for a solution. So you first understand exactly what it is you want to achieve, and then you start thinking about the objectives, the specifics, the metrics, many other things, right? And then the next thing you do is you think about the people who are going to use that, right? The players. Once you've thought through those 2 things, you understand these 2 very well, there you start thinking, oh, maybe points, badges, and leaderboards. Maybe I want to put in a narrative or a storytelling. Maybe I want to introduce here elements of, randomness. Maybe I want to introduce here these other elements, because you know who you are doing it for and what you want to achieve. If you don't know what you want to achieve, like a typical thing that I think it happens less, at least recently, because there's no hype, right? you get a client and the client says, oh yeah, well, I want to do gamification on this project. Like, okay, what do you want to get from gamification? Oh, well, the fun and the games, and we want to be there. Like, where do you want to be? What do we want to achieve? You want your employees to be more engaged with what? What do you want them? What are those attitudes that you want them to do? What are those desired actions? Like, let's get into, oh, I hadn't thought of that. Oh, okay. And that's where the work really starts.
Yeah, I mean, possibly when you say that, when clients say, oh, we want people to be engaged and have fun, possibly we are thinking, or the clients are thinking, that gamification is an end in itself, though it is essentially a means to doing something. If you're viewing that way, maybe you can start looking at it as a solution rather than or a solution to achieve something rather than the solution in itself, that just gamify it and you will achieve what you want to achieve.
Yeah, it's not an end. Gamification is not an end. I do agree. Like, there's many people who have said, like, well, if the world were more gamified, people would be having a lot more fun, and that makes sense. And work would be more engaging. But it's not just making the world a game. It's what, like, if you just say generally like that, you cannot come up with anything that makes sense, because you have a series of objectives. Whether that could be, happiness of people and them going to work and having, like, whatever that is, you need to understand it. And it's not the same to do that, for example, and focus on, I don't know, employee happiness, than to focus on absolute productivity. It's very different. I mean, the solution you're going to get is going to be different. The challenges you're going to face are going to be different. And the attitudes that you want to change are going to be changing to one side or the other. And that's a very simple example. There's many other things. Maybe it's not productivity, but I don't know, revenue. And sometimes revenue could have some of happiness and it could have some of productivity. And that there's an interesting mix. But your bottom line maybe is what you're looking for. I don't know. That depends on who you are targeting. And of course, you start getting the ethical considerations and all these things, which are super important. But they could be part of your objectives. Some people don't have them, but that's different.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And there is a separate thread that I was just thinking about as you were talking about it, that is there an overlap, at least in people's mind, between fun versus play? So play may be something which is useful when you design gamification. It doesn't mean that it has to be always fun or easy or cheerful also, those kind of things. But is there a confusion between fun versus play, especially when it comes to anything that has to be designed for learning purposes?
So there's Andrzej Marchewski, a past guest and a good friend. He likes to talk about, he's one of the ones. I mean, he's not the only one, but I've heard him more than others myself. I don't know if he's said it more or not. He likes to say that, gamification is not necessarily about fun. And even sometimes it's about, an activity that just openly sucks, that you have to do. It sucks. Gamification can come in to make it suck a little bit less. It's not going to be fun and joy and people, clapping around in the hallways, right? It might be just about people saying, well, I'm not dreading this activity anymore. I know I have to do it. I'm going to do it anyway, but I'm not dreading it, right? So maybe I do it earlier. Maybe I pay more attention, whatever that could look like. If it's a mandatory training, for example, it's a typical situation of, stick a pencil in my eye and let me run outside of here, right? That's the typical thing that most people think when they tell them, you have to go to this mandatory training.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's not, again, about people, sort of coming together and hugging each other and rainbows and, and unicorns. Maybe it's not just that. Sometimes it is about getting the job done in a way that people are actually willing to do it and they don't have to be forced into it. It can get to the next level. It might be fun, but it's not always possible. I mean, sometimes there's things that, quite frankly, are very difficult to get through. It's a hard pill to swallow. You just give the people a little bit of water and it's easier. Or you put a little bit of sugar onto the pill so that it tastes a little bit better. And you convince people that, it's maybe not the best. It's not going to be your go-to thing, but, you have to do it. So you're okay with doing it. So that's one of the things. And the other thing is, play and fun. You were mentioning two things, like it doesn't always have just to be fun. It could be difficult as well. Well, fun can be very hard. Nicole Lazzaro talks about hard fun as well, right? So there's things that are tasks that are very, very difficult inside a game. And it's not less fun because of that, right? It could be complex. It could be difficult. You can try it 100 times before you achieve it, but it's not less fun because of that, all right? So activities can be perfectly combined, difficult, and they can be fun. They can be difficult or challenging, and people are enticed to do them because they have some sort of motivation. That's where, again, you bring the whole motivation in. Sometimes a gamified project looks nothing like a game. Nothing, because the culture of the company is not well, or happy with that kind of result. And you say, well, we can use all these strategies. It's about understanding motivation and what moves and motivates people to do certain things, and then changing behavior. You can do all those things without something that looks, like a cartoon that says boom or whatever that could be.
Yeah. No, that reminds me of something that we experienced long back when we created something and it had a lot of mechanics that were added, and it was not easy and traditional fun that somebody would see, which is usually thought of as enjoyable, having a good time. And then we gradually cut out most of those because the stakeholders thought it won't work, or people are too busy, and this is a little difficult to do, etc. And they were hoping for fun, as we say. So maybe there is a colloquial meaning in L&D community about fun, which is having a good time, but that's not really what gamification is looking at. Absolutely. But yeah, I think that's one of the things that both you and us will fight against as we continue to improve that. So if I were to further distill your thoughts on, what makes gamification so compelling in your view for workplace learning specifically, since you work both for academics and you've taken solutions to the corporate sector as well, what have you found really compelling from a corporate's perspective, let's say, that gamification is something that they should be considering in their own L&D?
Thing is, in general, L&D has historically been and traditionally been all about the function. L&D is, what do we have to do? We have to get this training, and we have to do it, and we have to complete it, and we have to get employees to attend to the training and get a certificate. It's sort of completion focused. It's about doing the task. If you introduce, again, call it gamification or something else, the consideration that on the other side of the L&D spectrum are the people receiving the training, receiving the learning, having that experience themselves, you start considering and saying, oh, it's not just about them having to do it because we pay them to do it, so we're the company, we tell them what to do, which is fine. I mean, that's not untrue. Mm-hmm. But you think that there's a human on the other side, and how do you convince them or sell them the idea or get them to actually pay attention and be interested in this? Because again, sometimes the mandatory training is about, I don't know, typical sexual harassment, right? Which is a very thorny thing in workplaces, right? But it's mandatory. It's not mandatory because somebody is a jerk and put it as a mandatory thing. It's mandatory because it's important, right? So how do you get people not just to fill and sign the form that they attended the mandatory training, but to actually execute those behaviors, which is where L&D can go to the next level as well, right? It's not just about completing and the function of, you went to a training and I have the list that says 125 of our employees went. It's, well, how are those 125 employees actually applying whatever it is, mandatory or not mandatory, that they went through? So that's next level that I'm, in my opinion, L&D should be going for, because it makes it more relevant to the market, more strategic. And in terms of what people are typically interested in these kinds of things, the department is able to achieve greater levels of, budget and able to do more things and be more strategic, because it's, how does L&D, enable the company to achieve its objectives? You're an enabler of those objectives. You're maybe not the operations who was actually executing, the sales or whatever that looks like. You are enabling operations to do that. You're enabling finance to do their work better. You're enabling marketing to do whatever they have to do, right? And that is where I think L&D can make their role so much more relevant and actually have a real shot at having, those CLOs sitting at the board, right? The Chief Learning Officer. Why? Because it's strategic. It's important for the company to continue to learn and to adapt to whatever is coming out. And this could be from the manufacturing plant all the way up to a tech startup. This is very important because it lets you actually enable your employees to get better, to do their things better, to comply with the law, to come up with better ideas. Innovation is born in a place of learning as well, and in play spaces in that sense. So This can be very, very strategic, in my opinion. And that is something that I do think gamification can help a lot in, because you actually, from the start, you don't only, you have, of course, in your back mind, all of those learning objectives, what do you want to achieve with that training? And you're always sort of building on top of that, but you're also thinking, how am I getting people to actually learn this and then be able to apply it? Because if you just think about, oh, they need to learn this, if it has no application in the workplace, why are they taking the learning in the first place? Okay, so those are kind of the reflections that I get from these.
Well, absolutely, and the way I see it from what you were saying, there is, so traditionally we've been doing in the L&D community completions or tracking those kind of metrics, but then the next level is behavior, which is where if you are able to influence that, enable that, then you are able to make an impact on the business outcomes, any business metric that you take, whether it is less accidents or better bottom line or a top line margins, whatever. So, right. So, and gamification
or cultural change, in a company that is being bought by another company and there's a change in the culture, or you've realized that you have a toxic culture inside the company. This happens to real companies in real life. They realize it and say, oh my goodness, what have we been doing? We need to change some of these things. You're moving change comes with a learning curve, right? Some of the times it's formal learning, sometimes it's not formal learning, but you're changing an actual behavior. And that's not just through saying and having a statement and having the video from the CEO saying, from now on, we're not going to be doing these kinds of things. It takes a lot more than that, as many companies already know.
It's very interesting you bring that up, because we were discussing with a client recently about their big bang event around values and culture, which happened about a year ago. Everybody remembers the event, but nobody remembers anything else. So event was big bang, everybody had a good time, but it did not make an impact. So possibly using the right mechanics to carry it forward with the right kind of strategies would have been a little better.
Yeah, and maybe even insert it a bit more sprinkle it into the actual workplace, right? So it's more, I was talking to Roman the other day, I think the interview is not still live. He was talking about growth gamification and saying, well, the way that we approach it is not just having sort of an event focused thing, but something that actually carries out through the job so that it actually makes an impact in the job. It's not, I get out of the out and in of the game world. You're actually always in that game world, and it's actually impacting your everyday and the work.
True. And that's such a fundamental challenge that I think the L&D community faces. And I think the good thing is that many of them are beginning to move from that event-based mentality to a more spaced out programming mentality. I know, and that's why initially when I made that comment from CalCap about there are so many principles that are really similar in both of these, so that makes me very excited about the potential of gamification. Fantastic. So, Rob, since you have done so much of work, are there best practices that you think, of course, where it fits in, why it is important, overall structure, why it and how it can impact the business metrics? Are there best practices or anything that can be borrowed from a non-L&D world into the L&D world? Anything that you can think of that maybe?
I would think, again, thinking of this from a design perspective, and again, I know I've been sort of circling back to this, but the thing is, I do believe that there is a huge, and I'm actually starting to teach in a course that is the academic director is a designer. He's essentially a creative creator in general. And I love talking with him about this. But the thing is, when you're doing, and actually the master is about customer experience and innovation. So, you see how it like really fits in this whole model. Yeah. So the thing that what I'm trying to get at here is the main recommendation. I mean, always, of course, there's many frameworks and you can follow any of these. I mean, I think most of them are great. I mean, I'm a good friend with Yukai Chow and his Octalysis. Andrzej Marchewski has a method, and Kaufman's has a set of cards and how to do these things. There's many others. Again, there's many good ones. There's some people who are just, again, of course, look for somebody who's recognized within this world and not just anybody who talks about gamification. But there's many different frameworks you can follow, and you will see. I mean, I'm not saying it off the top of my head. You will see that they all have a methodology where you're thinking, well, what do I want to achieve? Who do I want to achieve it with? Understand it that intrinsically well and deeply, and there is where you start building other things. Then you have other recommendations, like, again, I just mentioned Roman Rakowitz from Germany. He was saying, I'm trying to completely extract any external or extrinsic motivation, not 100%, because that's typically not possible, but I want to focus very deeply just on intrinsic motivation. And that's true, that's great. But I had sort of a back and forth with him on the podcast. But there's sort of many tendencies on how you get onto that. But you won't get there to something good if you don't first understand the other stuff. And I can't emphasize enough. And then the other thing that I do think is important is to understand, just as with startups and new products and new projects and new services, is typically you will have a series of assumptions, right? Those assumptions could be right or they could be wrong, and that's fine. There is where you have to do a test or a playground or whatever you want to call it, where you test with real people what you're trying to achieve, see how it goes, and improve. Iterate, go back to the design phase, or maybe even back to the assumptions you made about the players, update those, design again, test again, until you are at least satisfied. I mean, this could go on for ages, but there is a certain point where you say, look, this is good enough, or we arrive to the date where we have to launch whatsoever, and that's good. But the idea of having several, or at least space for having several iterations on the same idea, I do think is crucial. And it's very super hard to get into the minds of the directives and the people who are paying for the budget and so on, because now we don't have time for that. Okay, so you have time for massive failure when the actual product comes out, right? It's a typical idea of, I'm an entrepreneur, I spent 2 years building something in my basement, I come out to the world and I have massive millionaire success. That doesn't really happen. They're out there testing, exchanging, seeing how things go and improving them, and that's where it all comes to fruition. It's not about spending alone by yourself, locked out from the world, doing that thing. At least in these days, it's not the case.
Very interesting. I mean, and I was just trying to summarize it in my head for myself, just to take away the notes from there. So one is framework. Pick up one of the frameworks and processes which are very similar in terms of how you want to do it. The second is focusing on the motivation aspects. I also agree that you can't always just focus on the intrinsic ones. External motivators are important as well. The trick is actually, in my view, how do you convert from external to internal over a period of time, if you are able to?
It's the first door, especially.
Absolutely.
Indeed, when it's a long-term thing that you want to achieve, it's not a campaign that is specific to a week or something. There you can run it with almost only extrinsic. But if you're looking for something that extends in time, you probably want to look at intrinsic.
Perfect.
For sure.
And the last point that you mentioned was around maybe play testing, just testing it again and again and again to refine it. You will never get it right on the first go. And you touched on the key concern that comes up. We don't have time. That's really what clients will think. But I think we'll gradually get there as more and more people understand why it is important, and how it will eventually make an impact. So you can do a quick work out of it. You can do a quick output, but it may not really give you the results. And we'll come back again at some point of time to revisit that. Very interesting. Any examples that stand out from your work which you are able to share, where you may have seen that sort of a business impact, since you worked again with a lot of companies, I know?
There's one thing that this is sort of goes through companies and universities as well. There's this simulation that we use at IE and created at IE that is all about how a common resource is managed. And we could easily have sort of preconceptions about how this works, right? So typically the typical thing is you say, oh yeah, the people who are predating on the oceans and the species that are endangered and so on, they're essentially bad people. They're different from us, right? So that's a separate human being. When you get to experience a situation, which could be the situation of your company tomorrow, and you get to experience a situation where you kind of become the bad guy, and there's not even real stakes there. It's all about, getting the company to grow and make more money, but you have to make some difficult choices between doing one thing or the other. Those incentives are there, and they are out there in the real world. So it's not the same thing, standing from your spot and judging other people out there. When you actually get to do some sort of immersive experience and experience it yourself, there is where I do think real learning can happen. Whether, again, that is, well, these kinds of situations, you probably want to actually extract them from the real workplace, because you don't want to commit these kinds of mistakes and do these types of unethical behavior or whatever. But that is when certain switches like go off and say, oh my goodness, like I was that guy. How do I put, controls on myself and my employees now that I understand the situation a bit better? And what are the incentives that are in that for companies to actually be executing these kinds of behaviors? And that's one example of that kind of thing. Like you think, I don't know. You think about how financial crisis came to be and say, these guys were just greedy bankers and terrible people and so on. Kind of maybe that is a component, but then the incentives were there for those people to be doing and executing those actions in that way. So if you manage to make some sort of situation where people can experience that and be the bad guy, again, be the guy who's profiting on, the poor people or whatever that looks like, right? And then say, and then you ask them like, how did that go for you? It's like, oh my goodness, I was that guy, I was that girl who was doing this thing that I shouldn't have been doing because the incentives were in place and I didn't realize. So how do I put myself in my own sort of mental controls to realize when these kinds of situations are coming up? So that's just an example. I think just like that, there's many other things that can benefit from that. Again, sometimes it's about extracting the employee or the person from their work and having this sort of made up situation and experience this. And sometimes it's about actually experiencing within the workshop those incentives, and maybe it's for more productivity, maybe it's to change behavior. And it's sort of about going into the day-to-day and helping them these things. And that was, again, just one of the examples.
Sure. Excellent. Yeah, I mean, there have been so many financial ones that come to mind.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I have a meditation app, and there's a meditation on compassion, right? So the guy starts by saying, "Oh, compassion makes the world go around." Well, except the parts of the world that have to do with banking. Like literally, that's a phrase he uses, right? And yes, it's true. Banking cannot be fueled by compassion in general because, they go broke, but it cannot be fueled by greed either. And that's where, they eventually go broke as well, but they break tons of people in the middle. So it's about striking that balance and realizing the impact of what you're doing.
Yeah. And I think whenever a situation like this emerges, it becomes a great case study to say, your compliance training matters, but how you do it will matter even more. You can, people do take notice when something goes wrong and it is there in their conscience for a little while, but then again, unless you can change behavior.
This is just an anecdote and it's not directly related to this topic, but you were saying that, and I remembered here in Europe, there came a new legislation about, financial markets and so on. I'm guessing it had to do with the crisis. I arrived after that. So the funny thing here is that one of the things that the law said is that, and I'm just surprised that it was not the case before, is that people who give financial advice have to be, financially sort of literate, basically. They have to have, or it was like, so that was not the case. and the course was about, basic economics, finance. It was like, really? I mean, and it's not about checking a tick box, which they had to check. Of course, they had to comply with the law. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to operate as a bank. But I mean, didn't these people already know that? And the answer seems to be no. And again, it's not just about taking them through 10,000 hours of training. It's about how that is going to actually impact the day-to-day job that comes in. And that's one of the few situations where I can tell you that hopefully, legislation is actually helping people do a better job.
Yeah. No, I think it's important because all of these legislations, whatever they are, whenever wherever they are created, they are essentially from experiences. What has gone wrong and how it has destroyed people and their lives. So it is important to be in place because else it would have been a very different world if everybody was able to follow their conscience and exactly know what is to be done and what is right for everyone else. It's very difficult. And like you said,
It's very
if the
difficult
incentives are
knowing what is right and wrong. That's a difficult question as
it
well,
is
many times.
it is. And like you mentioned, if you are being put in a situation where you are the bad guy, all the incentives are in place, you've not been trained enough or, made aware enough about what are the consequences of your actions, you will just go that way. So you
And don't get me wrong, banks are important and necessary. I mean, you don't want to make banks disappear. That's
absolutely,
very important.
absolutely. I'm just coming to saying that the legislation is important and it has been done for the right reasons. Possibly the way we have been training people on them has been more just a mandatory compliance blanket that we put over it and say you have to do it. So it's more like a stick approach, so which hopefully changes and it helps the outcomes with the compliance training as well. Fantastic. Rob, you mentioned one part which was around, play testing and hence time becomes a constraint sometimes. Are there other challenges that you face sometimes when you work with clients, cost, ability to do it themselves, anything else? These are two, three that have come to our attention in discussions with clients. Cost is too high for gamification. It takes a lot of time. We don't have much skills, etc., etc.
Well, it's the big question is how important are those objectives that they want to achieve for them? If they're important enough, sometimes they're not. Like sometimes you can achieve those objectives, and again, the cost is higher than the benefit, and you say, well, probably this project doesn't make any sense. But pretty often, that change in behavior does make a lot of sense in introducing that element of gamification. It can come at a higher cost because, as we've been talking throughout the interview, it requires more thought, more planning, more design than just, it's not pushing content. It's about getting content that comes through. It's you can push the content and people see it or click on the video and leave it playing there and go to the restroom or go have a coffee while the video is playing and going on next. Or do you want to make sure that people are learning something and they're getting something? Not just about having a test at the end, which kind of makes sense, kind of doesn't. It's not just about that. It's about actually getting to see if that is actually going to make sense. Sometimes this training is crucial. So again, it's going to depend very much on that. But the other sort of resistance, and I'm sure you've experienced this, is, oh, we're a serious company. We're not going to do this kind of thing. We're very serious here. We can't do that. Or I hate games. I don't know if you've ever heard that one. Yeah. It's like, well, do you have a kid? Have you ever played with your kid? Do you like sports? Those are games as well. Sports are games, and we can learn a lot from sports as well. So those are the kind of resistance you get. With the resistance to the term gamification, there is a massive discussion, or not even discussion. There's like a massive divide. There's people who are saying, you know what, I do gamification, I call it gamification, I'm pushing for this, and I'm betting on this actually becoming more mainstream and as named gamification, and that's the thing, and that's where I distinguish myself from people who are not doing gamification. There's other people, who are also doing gamification, also pushing for the industry, but are calling it, behavioral science, are calling it engagement management, or whatever that could look like, right? So they're basically ignoring the challenges and the difficulties of calling it, gamification with the, the thing that happens, people think of games, fun, family, and not work and productive activities. So you can go either way. I respect both. They have pretty good reasons to go for both, but you'll be facing different clients and challenges as well.
Mm. But for people who really face this issue, especially from their senior-most stakeholders who think, games and hence gamification are for children, it's not for a serious workplace. I mean, is it just good to go with some case studies and share this is what we've achieved? But it is also a cultural challenge that they may be having internally. So have you had to resolve that sometimes?
Yeah, the thing is, as you were saying, showing case studies, especially if you have case studies where it doesn't look like this, right? So it's not comic looking, it's not, pink characters and something very flashy in the sense of very gamey, but it's rather a series of strategies that you use and a series of mechanics that look like something, relatively typical in that sense, or it could look typical, but they have all this thought behind and the inspiration that you get from games. If you can show those cases and say, look, but this is also gamification, or this is the things that we do, and we've had success here, this and that you can share, I do think that helps a lot in that challenge. And honestly, sometimes, as in any other type of consultancy or design, sometimes it's just not the right solution. And sometimes the company is not there. And you might try to convince them, you put all your, your artillery, you shoot for it. And sometimes they will just say, look, it's not for us. And that's fine.
Yeah. Obviously, you can't sell to everyone. All right. I think I'm just at the end of my list of things that I want to post to you. I have been curious about how you think, beyond workplace or corporate in general. Have you been? I'm sure you've been thinking. So I'll check what sort of thoughts you have on that. Where does gamification lead us? What can it do for the world? There have been, like you mentioned, I think you did touch on it. The whole world was gamified. So what do you think of that?
I mean, Ready Player One kind of exhibits a little bit of that, but also it's a bit apocalyptic, like in the sense that it's just deepening the social divide and so on. And of course, that could happen, and it could happen because of that or because of other, greedy reasons and then the balance of power and so on. But I do think that the whole idea and concept behind people being so immersed in their life that they feel it's a game and that they feel engaged by it, I do think that's something that gamification can achieve. And that could be, again, in the workplace, but it could be in education and your experience as a learner. It could also be your experience as a customer as well. So it's from the workplace towards their customers, and that involves marketing, that involves a customer experience. There's like so many things that can happen from that. And there's almost, an infinite number of problems that you can solve using this, that I think that the limits are very, very, very far away from where we are now. And I do think there can be a lot of good from that. And there's initiatives like Games for Good, where they build games to make some social impact or some change or environmental impact or sustainability impact. There's a lot of that. In fact, I recently interviewed a couple of professors from Germany who had what they called the sustainability games. And the idea was that students were engaged in that activity of creating a game that was helping one of the sustainability or teach one of the sustainability goals of the UN. So, I mean, there's so much, like the universe is so vast with these things. And I do think that there is, I talk a lot about it in education, engagement crisis in education. People are not engaged, not interested, not there. But that it's not only in education. This happens in the workplace. This happens in family life. This happens, in social life. There's so many places where this is happening. And there's people. One of my listeners I talk a lot to. She does sort of gameful project management and gameful activities for or self-gamification, I think is how she calls it. Like there's like so many sprouting ideas and things that you could use gamification for on yourself, even, that I think the possibilities are almost endless.
Yeah, very interesting. And yeah, I mean, social influence of games is of course a big one if you can use it positively. I was also recalling something that we posted recently about innovation and finding protein structures through a game called Folded. I'm sure you've heard of that. So that's an interesting one. Yeah. There's so many wonderful uses that we can put it to. Fantastic. So I'm sure gamification is like we talked about, going through that hype cycle at a point where it is finding its real use and the right mechanics and the right reasons, then it is going to grow from here. And with people like you, I'm sure a lot of people can leverage your experience and what you have done so that they can use it meaningfully in their businesses and whatever areas of work they are in.
All fingers crossed.
So before we close, Rob, what is the best place to find you if our listeners were to find you? Is it LinkedIn? Is it somewhere else?
I would say my webpage or the podcast, professorgame.com, and there you can subscribe to the email list. You will have access directly to me. I read every email. I try to reply every one of them. That's one of the objectives, that it's not always achieved, but I do read every single one of them for sure. I'm also on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram a lot less. We have a webpage on Facebook as well. But I would say the email list is probably the best place, or even the podcast itself, where you will listen to all these things. I invite you as well to go to the email list, and I think that will be one of the best places to keep updated and find most of the information I'm sharing.
Fantastic, fantastic. And before I let you go, I also want to see do you have any book recommendation? You mentioned a couple of names as you were talking, and especially for L&D people, if I can say, if they are thinking, oh, let's do some gamification in our company.
You were mentioning Carl Kapp, and he's kind of a classic in the learning and gamification space. I would say most of his books, Carl Kapp's books are fantastic. They're very deep in that sense. And that is a good thing for many people, and that is a not so good thing for many people. So again, depends on the profile. If you want to go like super deep and understand all the theories behind it, all the science that is behind all these things, I think Carl Kapp's books are phenomenal, or they're fantastic, and they're deep. Again, as I was saying before, I do think he's a fantastic person in this space, and has done a lot of research, and it's more than one book that he has on the topic, and he's been doing this for quite a while.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. Rob, I have to thank you for this wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for your time. I wish you the very best with your work as well as your podcast. May it continue to grow.
Thank you.
Thank you.